Hello, myself Sunil Ramakrishna. Here, basically, we are discussing another topic that is city creation. City creation. Basically, we are discussing another topic that is SBI account, Amazon account, and after 2 days, basically, the big earthquake is going to come to India. So that topic actually we are discussing. In this, basically, we discuss lots of things. In this, basically, one of the person told that the world basically is going to take the control of everything, basically, right? Everything they are going to take the control. For example, the trees basically has is going to convert to human clone because 1 lakh t is equal 1 lakh tree equal to 2 3 human clones basically. Like this, basically the world is getting created basically. So instead of tree, basically now basically they are going to create big buildings that they see and everything. So entire natural control basically they are going to take basically. That basically is the plan of one of the group basically, and that basically they are already doing it. So in this basically one of the person told that currently Russia and Ukraine war basically is ongoing basically, right? Then basically one of the person told that in this Iran, Iraq basically and Israel, like this also war is ongoing. Then one of the person told that Russia basically president is supporting Indian group basically, and Europe basically is supported by India group basically. So reason because in Europe basically more than 20 crore Indians basically are staying. So by default basically India have to support Europe basically. Otherwise basically that 20 crore will get end. But by chance basically it got end basically. 20 crore basically by chance people died basically. Just assume basically. They basically died. 20 crore. So what is going to happen basically? Then by default basically India is going to support Russia only. By default they have to support Russia basically. Why? Because 20 crore people basically has died. But do you think basically this is going to happen? But one of the person told that Prime Minister basically is supporting Russian Putin basically. That is also thing basically. Why? Because there are lots of business basically that is going off from Russia side basically. Lots of business basically of India basically is ongoing by Russia group basically, and India is also basically lots of earning basically from Russian group basically. So they can't spoil the relationship with Russia also. And Congress is telling that basically we are supporting Europe group basically. So BJP is supporting Russian group, Congress is supporting European group, American group. So like this basically that is ongoing basically. So one person basically asked the question, when basically the India is going to jump into the war basically. That is question basically because one day basically India also have to jump into the war. So just a minute. When basically that time is going to happen basically. Just a minute. So when that time is going to come basically, that when India is going to jump into the war basically. So one person told the question basically, India basically mostly will not jump into the war. Why? Because if India will jump, then basically the lots of investment basically of Indian people basically are outside India. So that is going to affect directly. Directly means very badly the investment is going to affect. And that in that basically the bank will be get in trouble basically. Banks group basically will get in trouble. Just a minute. So banks group basically are going to be in trouble. So if banks groups are basically going to in trouble, they will stop any war basically. They will basically the finance group, the banks group. Then basically why they were not able to stop the war of Ukraine and Russia basically. Lots of people says that just lots of people says that the banks group basically can stop the war basically. Then why they are not able? Why they basically are not able to stop the war of Ukraine and Russia basically? That is question, na, basically. Because if by chance basically Russia group will stop the war, then by default Russia is going to end. That is by default basically. That basically If Russia will not say that, basically that I'm basically telling. If Russia basically will surrender, he and then basically he will stop the war, then Europe group basically is going to end Russia. That is 100% sure. Just a minute. So that's why Russia will never able to stop the war. Why? Because there are more than basically 1 lakh soldier basically died from both sides basically. Minimum basically amount number basically I'm telling. So war is basically not going to stop here basically. So one person basically asked the question, why basically war basically started? Because this was the requirement basically. When 100 crore child is going to happen basically, that time basically the war situation has happened. That means the European land and Russian land basically, they are not going to produce the child basically, because child basically comes from sand land only basically. Child energy basically, that is the souls basically, data basically, that comes from land only. So just so one person asked the question, the European land basically, there basically the birth is not going to happen basically, because if war is happening, then basically the birth basically can't happen basically. That means European group, Russian group basically are taking power supply and giving them and getting the power supply from other than Russia and Europe basically. That is question basically. Just a minute. That is question. So one person basically asked the question, somebody is basically verifying the thing basically related to power supply basically, because power supply is everything basically. Whatever power supply you are getting basically in the environment or basically in the house or wherever from the office basically, that basically just. So whatever basically data the world is getting, that means Russian group and the European group are getting power supply from where basically? Because they are not getting power supply from Europe and Russia. That is 100% sure basically. If you want to write down basically anywhere, you can write down basically. Why? Because when war basically starts, that time basically the power supply which is they are getting, that is getting from other than Russia and Europe basically. That is 100% sure. That is the rule of the war basically. Otherwise, basically, why the war started? That is also question basically. Why war basically started? Because power supply of Russian, somebody basically have doubt of power supply of Russia and power supply of Ukraine basically, or basically the Europe also basically. If the war will spread, then it will be Europe, London, everything basically comes into the picture. So somebody basically have doubt related to power supply which is getting to the Europe and Russia, or basically that they are giving the power supply. So world basically is not getting power supply of Europe and Russia. So just so one person told that if it's like this basically, if it is like this, that means somebody is verifying the stuff basically. Because in Europe and Russia basically there are many nuclear plants. There are basically many nuclear plants basically. Just there are many nuclear plants. So in this verification, that group is going to do the verification of India also basically. That means India is getting power supply from where basically, because they have to do the verification. If they have done the verification of Europe and Russia, and Europe and Russia basically has created India basically. That means they have to do the verification of India also. So in future basically war is going to start in India also. So Indian army basically have to be ready basically. If you want to write down anywhere basically you can write down it basically, because somebody want to verify. Then basically one of the person told that why they are verifying this basically, why they are verifying it basically. That is also question basically, why they are verifying it basically. Is there any basically requirement basically of the verification? Somebody is verifying the stuff basically. So is there any requirement basically related to this? If in India basically the war will start by chance basically, but mostly war will happen basically. That is 100% sure basically. So investment group, the banking group, they have to be ready basically. Why? Because war is going to happen. That is 100% sure. Whether basically the Prime Minister Modi will tell basically don't do war, or basically the any of the group basically will say that basically don't do war. But mostly war basically will happen basically, because war basically doesn't war basically is don't listen the any of the person basically, because they want to verify, they are going to verify it basically. So Russia group, European group, they have basically then one of the person basically asked the question, just a minute. Russian group basically know that they are getting power supply from their power supply is completely stopped from the world basically. That group basically know, or basically the European group basically know that their power supply to the world basically has stopped, because their power supply is stopped to the world basically. For example, I will take one example. Power supply chain is like this: USA, Europe, Russia, then South Africa, then South Africa to India. In this basically, Europe and Russia basically is removed, and rest of chain basically has happened. So if by chance basically Russia and Europe chain basically has broken. By chance, basically, Russia and European chain. By chance means it has broken basically. So if it has broken, power supply chain basically has broken. That means the India basically power data also basically might have broken basically, or basically it going to break, or basically what basically we can say, what basically we can add here. So one person told that basically you can't, for example, you are basically passing the power supply of India land to other country basically. So what is the way basically? Then he told that way basically is the only way. That is the energy group basically. They only takes the energy through sun solar system. Basically, you can pass the India land data to European land basically. That means sun solar system is installed in Europe basically, and from India energy basically whatever energy you are getting, that energy basically will dump into the sun solar system of Europe basically. That is possible basically. That is not possible, right? Because sun solar system basically takes that data only basically which is there required basically. If they required India, then basically they will take the India data. But sun solar system basically is in India only. Sun solar system is in India, just a minute. Sun solar system is in India only. So one of the person told that India also have to jump into war, because if they have broken the chain of Russia and Europe across the world basically, that means India is also going to jump into war. That is 100% basically. One day basically this war will happen basically here. So one of the person told that if India will do the war basically, which will be the country basically? Then one person told that China, but China basically war is already happened basically. Then again basically war is going to Pakistan. Pakistan lots of Pakistani basically are working in India. Then basically they are going to do war basically. Then basically who will be that country basically? Which country would be that basically? That is question basically. Which country will be that? Just one person told that as if suddenly basically in one country more than 1 lakh Indian people basically died. So now basically India have to jump into war. And mostly basically I am telling you, India is going to start a war this way only basically. My calculation basically says this only basically, of the war calculation. Basically. If you watch my each and every videos basically, you will get the exact parameter basically, of each and everything basically which I have displayed basically. So this is also one of the parameter basically. If by chance, not by chance basically, 100% basically I am telling you, this is going to happen. If you want to write basically any of the basically foreign minister or basically whoever basically want to write, you can write it down. By chance basically, war will start and India will start the war basically. How basically it's going to happen? More than 1 lakh people basically, that is the Indian people basically died in any of the country. That means 1 lakh, more than 1 lakh people, Indian people basically died or basically die in outside India. That means which country basically might be? Which country might be? Just one person told that asked the question basically, which country might be basically? Because due to that only the war is going to start. Because there is no other link basically which we are getting for the war basically. But India is also basically going to jump into war. That is basically 100% sure. That is 100% sure. If you want to mark my word, you can write it down somewhere basically. That is war is going to happen. War is going to happen. Then lots of people says that the people who are basically telling about the war basically they are basically getting beaten by the public or basically by the some other group only. But this is the fact basically. Yeah. Why basically Russia and Europe group basically started the war? They have some doubt basically. They basically have some doubt. Basically. That's why basically the war has started. Just a minute. That means war will happen basically in India. So one of the person told that assume that basically war started in India. So which state basically is going to jump into war? Because there are more than 39 weight states. Basically. So one person told that basically there are basically many states here created unnecessarily. So this was actually planned or basically what? Basically? Somebody has planned this war basically. That in future basically if India basically in India also war will happen basically. We have already created 39 states, more than 39 states. Few states basically will end also basically. Then also India is not going to get effect basically. Few people tell basically this also basically. That war is pre-planned basically. Because there was nothing basically required of creating the new states basically. There was no requirement of the states basically. New states basically there is no requirement basically. Then why the states basically created? That means war is going to happen basically in India, and few states basically are going to end from India. But here the question is, by chance basically India basically in India basically started the war, that means whole India basically is going to jump into war basically, that is 100% sure. So more than 1 lakh people basically were died basically, that country will become enemy of India, because war basically if it will start basically like this only basically the way the war is going to start, and that will be the visa department. So just a minute. So that will be the visa department who are responsible for this war. Why? Because they have issued the visa and their people basically died, and their people died means their insult has happened basically. And if their insult basically happened, that means it was basically insult of Indian government, because they are part of the government. So what are the situation basically going to happen? They will say that basically we basically will not jump into the war basically, but mostly that is not going to happen. Yeah. Public is going to leave basically. Public will say that basically we want basically, if 15, 16 soldier also basically died, the Indian army basically what they do basically, they basically jump into the country basically, POK basically, or basically I don't know, Jammu Kashmir basically, wherever basically they jumps, and they basically starts the war basically. But here basically it would be 1 lakh people. So there basically 100% war is going to happen. So war basically mostly basically this would be the reason basically. If by chance basically war will start basically, but mostly war will not start. But then also war will start. Then basically what you are going to do basically? Then anything you can do basically, because 1 lakh people basically has already died. Anything basically you can do. So one of the person told that basically, bhai H1B visa USA has issued. Then basically Europe has issued this many citizenship. America has issued this many green cards. Then American presidency is Biden basically. He's an Indian basically. And then basically the European presidency is already Indian basically. So this country would be. Do you think basically this country would be where basically the 1 lakh people basically is going to die? Because they are Indian only. So which country would be that? Just so which country would be? Would be which country? So there is no answer basically. Why? Because you don't know the future basically of the Indian nationality. One person basically asked the question, 10 crore project basically was created. 10 crore project basically was created. One 100 crore child is going to happen. In that basically Sunil R. Nair generation ended. That Sunil R. Nair basically was knowing that his generation basically is going to end. No, basically. Mumbai has basically ended Sunil R. Nair generation. So is that basically the Sunil R. Nair basically was knowing? No, basically he was not knowing. Like same way basically, the world is also, sorry, the Indian nationality also basically will end like this only. But mostly basically, one of the person told that why basically if anybody requires any reason basically for war basically. So what would be that reason basically? Some personal story basically would be there. For example, he went to there in Dubai and he basically not got the job. So government created this as a, that as a story basically. that हमारा Indian था, he basically not got the job. In that basically it was Indian citizenship. In that basically the Indian visa was issued. They basically not given the job. So like this basically they create the story basically. Like this basically. From that story basically, do you think basically the war will start basically? No basically. So mostly possibilities of war basically would be this only. That is, more than 1 lakh people basically will die, and India basically have to jump into war, and then basically the war of India basically will start. And mostly possibilities are this only. But India and Europe, sorry, America and USA basically country would be that basically. Lots of people says that South Africa basically is also controlled by Indian group basically, because lots of Uttar Pradesh people basically are handling USA basically. Sorry, South Africa. But they also basically, do you think basically they might be staying there basically now in this situation basically, because they know that basically anything basically can happen. They basically just required one story, so they basically don't want to be part of story basically. So mostly basically the people who knows this, so they basically has left South Africa, mostly basically has left Europe, mostly has left USA, because they don't want to become a story basically of the government basically. That big businessman basically was of Indian basically, and he died basically. He was killed by one of the person basically. In that basically story basically the war will start. That businessman basically group knows this everything. So mostly they basically will not want to become a story of war basically. So they will immediately leave that place basically. And mostly after European and Russian group basically war has started, most of 90 percentage businessmen basically came back to India basically. You will not able to believe it basically. Few people basically came basically, but late basically. But they also basically came. Why? Because they don't want to become the story of war basically. Otherwise, basically Europe basically assume that basically one big Indian businessman basically killed. Indian group basically got one chance basically that our Indian businessman basically ended here basically by European group, and Europe and India basically war will start. But do you think basically that is going to happen? Why? Because more than 20 crore Indian people basically are staying in Europe basically, and that basically how that has they have they have basically posted there basically there, they have placed there basically that basically we everybody know basically how they were planned basically there basically that we know that in the previous video basically we have saw that. Just a minute. So what is going to be happen? That is the question. One of the person basically told what is going to happen basically, because war will happen. Even basically you have the control of entire money of South Africa. Even basically the businessmen basically they ran from South Africa. Even the big businessmen basically ran from South Africa, and they are controlling the business from India. So do you don't basically can able to think that basically up to this level basically. So Europe and USA basically never will do that basically. Why? Because they are Indian only basically. They are going to kill the Indian basically. That mostly basically they will not do it. Why? Because in USA basically, I will take one example basically. You will not able to believe it basically. The people basically who are doing the government jobs now basically, they mostly basically who are into the big post basically, they are basically died in front of the world basically. I will take one example, few example basically. Why basically the war they will not start? In USA basically you can see basically sometimes basically you get the news. In this car accident, this many people basically died. In that car accident, these people basically died. They basically has created the story basically. The police literally basically creates this story. They basically do the photo shoot, but really basically that people has that person basically has already escaped from that area basically. So that person basically has become America government employee basically. In future basically he will convert to presidency also basically, and he is basically controlled by which group basically? That is Indian only basically. So do you think basically war will start by America? Not possible. In Europe also basically the creation of European government is also basically happened like this only. South African government are also basically created like this only basically. So do you think basically they are going to finish the 1 lakh Indian basically? Not possible. So which will be that way basically? In that basically the 1 lakh people will die, and the war basically between India and that country will start immediately. That will be the emergency situation of India basically country. And in this basically many states, extra states are also created. Why they are created? That is also question basically. So in next video basically we are going to see basically a little bit more about this topic, that suddenly basically 1 lakh people basically of Indian nationality basically died in any of the country basically, where even basically they have the control of government, and how basically they keep the control, that basically we have already discussed. So in next video basically we are going to see a little bit more about this topic.